Let me quote from a report of the Cabinet Office in the UK, The Future of the Third Sector in Social and Economic Regeneration. This was released in July 2007. And see if you recognize the Canadian government in it. The UK government recognizes the value of the diversity of organizations in the sector in providing voices for underrepresented groups, in campaigning for change, in creating strong, active, and connected communities, in promoting enterprising solutions to social and environmental challenges, and in transforming the delivery and design of public services. The third sector has always been at the heart of social and environmental change, and the government wants to continue to work to create the conditions where organizations can grow and achieve their aims. Notice there's no reference to special interest groups or organizations that really don't have any legitimacy because they're not elected. This is a vision of a full partnership that relies on the capacity of what they call in the UK the third sector to mobilize people. That should be our vision also. What do we need to get there? Well, I think we need three things. First of all, we need to release the potential which exists. Secondly, we need to create capacity. And thirdly, we need to articulate a new story of what we do and the role we play. And you'll notice that these are not very different from what we've just identified collectively through the exercise we went through a moment ago. Release the potential. We labor in Canada under an extraordinarily stifling set of regulations. The responsibility, in a sense, for regulating the sector is given to a body whose fundamental purpose is to collect taxes. This is not a vision about how you strengthen the community sector. This is regulation by people whose responsibility it is to maximize revenue for the government. And it's uniquely Canadian. In other governments like Australia and New Zealand and the UK, of course, where we have a shared experience and body of legal precedents and so on, they've moved on. UK created something called the Charity Commissioners, whose function is in part to regulate, but also to support and strengthen the sector. The definition of charity in Canada goes back to 1604. You would be astonished at the applications for what we would all consider, I think, activities destined to improve the public good, which are disallowed because they don't conform to the statutes that were enforced in the Elizabethan era. Limits on the ways we can generate revenue. Entrepreneurialism may be a good thing when it comes to business, but I can tell you it's not viewed favorably by the Canada Revenue Agency. Charities are not allowed to conduct businesses or to find ways to generate revenues or earn income. A rigid accountability regime. This can't be laid solely at the feet of the CRA. We all know that government, particularly at the federal level, has become so mesmerized by the need for more controls and restrictions and limitations, all in the guise of accountability, that most of the work we do is tied in red tape so tight that there is little room for innovation or experimentation. Disincentives for risk-taking. It's not even that we're not encouraging people to try new ways of addressing challenges. It's that they are actively discouraged from doing so. I was a little surprised that in the question, where would you go if you had a new idea, people said to funders. I answered that question and put it last. Because I think most funders are extremely resistant to new ideas and very nervous about risk. In fact, they seem to think that the major risk is to their investment or their grant, which is surprising, since people who make grants actually expect zero financial return. The real risk, of course, is for the organization or the individuals who are carrying out something which is a little bit unconventional or a little bit new. So these are all ways in which I think our ability to evolve and innovate are being stifled, and they need to be changed. But we also need new tools. And I want to talk specifically about the issue of funding, because that's the one that I think is most directly important to all of the work that you do. And it's going to become more important, because I think clearly when we look at the deficits that governments are facing, we can expect that there's going to be tremendous pressure on grants and contributions. And it's not possible in Canada to think of private donations replacing government support. The disparity in the level of support is too great. Most people aren't aware that almost half of the revenue raised in the not-for-profit sector comes from earned income. It's from fees and memberships and cost of services and so on. But as I said earlier, highly restricted. And what I want to talk about for a moment is the ways in which this is now being addressed, mostly outside of Canada, but also in Canada, by people who are saying, we need to get away from this binary notion that you either get financial return or social return. You're either going to maximize profits or you're going to maximize public benefit. When in fact there is an area in between the two where you can have what is called a blended return. And similarly, where there's only two kinds of income possible. One is grants or contributions, and the other is earned income. It's possible to operate with a mix. And we're seeing experiments now, particularly in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, where people are moving into this area of what we call social finance. The challenge, of course, is to raise new capital for people in the sector. And in the UK, this has been done through a series of measures, the creation of a certain kind of corporate structure called a community interest company, where the purpose of the company is to blend the social and financial return. There's a group here in Canada now working on this, a social finance task force with people like former Prime Minister Paul Martin and Sam Dubach, who's a venture capitalist in Toronto, and others, Tamara Vrooman from the Van City Credit Union and so on, putting together a series of recommendations as to how governments in Canada could help to create a social finance marketplace. And I could talk a little bit later, if you like, about a new concept called the social impact bond, where in fact organizations that can demonstrate particular effectiveness can actually issue a bond to the public. The first one has been just launched in Britain. It's in the area of the corrections system, because they've calculated the saving to the state if people are prevented from going back and reoffending. And so they've developed this social impact bond concept where the savings, which are of the order of very close to $100,000 a year, that's the cost of keeping somebody in the justice system, those savings can be split between the government and the organization that's doing the program. Building capacity, I'll just very quickly talk about a couple of things. First of all, collaboration, but I think everyone has already identified that as being a critical need. There's a lot of material that's been written on this. The last issue of the Harvard Business Review, Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, talks about the need to create a much better collaboration between people in the private sector and people in the community sector. Government and community sector, again, there's material that's been written by Jeff Mulligan of the Young Foundation in the UK, and also by Root Cause in the United States, giving examples of how government and people in the community sector have been able to collaborate more effectively. In Canada, it's beginning. We have examples. The third area, of course, is collaboration within the community sector itself. Co-location, for example, the notion of hubs. In Toronto, you have the Centre for Social Innovation. In Calgary, you have the Kananoff Centre. You have now buildings being put up in Toronto and Montreal by environmental organizations, which will become places where environmental groups can work together. It's not just large organizations that are doing this. There's a man in Barrie who's created something called the Common Roof Foundation, which is simply pulling together small organizations, and Barrie is not a large place, pulling together small organizations so that they can become tenants of a common building, but not owners of it. The whole point is they continue to pay rent to the Common Roof Foundation, which allows them to continue charging, where appropriate, government or other funders for the real costs of accommodation. The Common Roof Foundation then actually makes a donation back to those organizations based on the profits that they're making, and those then become part of the revenue stream of the tenants. So there are lots of examples of effective collaboration within the sector, but this has to really, I think, be encouraged enormously. Training. There's a woeful lack of opportunities for skill development on the part of people in the sector. But again, we're beginning to see some change in this. The Mars Discovery District in Toronto has got something called Social Entrepreneurship 101, with literally hundreds of people who have an idea, but they want to be in an environment where they can test that idea with other people, where they can see whether there's a possibility here to create a business plan which would be viable and sustainable. And this model is beginning to develop. Again, I could give you some more examples. Capacity Waterloo, the same notion, where in that case, out of the private sector, a hub which was really designed to encourage high technology startups in the Waterloo region then said, we can't have a dynamic community based solely on high-tech companies. We need to have a dynamic environment to attract people to work for our companies. So they created within Capacities Waterloo a residence, an executive in residence, somebody who would be there as a consultant, advisor, mentor for local community organizations to go to if they have issues that they're dealing with in terms of human resources or fundraising or board relationships or what have you. I could talk about technology support, but there's also research. One of the biggest challenges that we face, particularly in looking at new ways of financing the sector, is our lack of any commonly accepted framework for measuring results. And that's one of the reasons why I'm looking particularly forward to this afternoon's presentation. A study by McKinsey and the Foundation Center of the United States identified 150 different methods to try to track the results accomplished by not-for-profit organizations. Everything from social return on investment, balanced scorecard, etc. Many of these are familiar, but there's nothing which has the kind of legitimacy or profile of a financial statement in the private sector. We need that if we're to ensure that capital goes where it can be most productive. So, these are some of the challenges that I think we're facing. We're not alone. The most recent IBM study of CEOs in global corporations indicated that 79% of CEOs in these very large multinational organizations expect their worlds to become much more complex in the near future. Only 49% felt that they were equipped to deal with that greater complexity. What we have to do, I think, is first of all shift the focus attention away from gross domestic product as virtually the only indicator of the health of our society to something which is much more comprehensive. Something along the lines of the Canadian Index of Well-Being, or perhaps the emergent vital signs reports that many community foundations are beginning to put together, or perhaps even the New Economics Foundation's Happy Planet Index, which we may hear about today. We have to shift the perception of the work we do as being that of the caring sector to that of the creative sector. We have to help people understand that in dealing with the kinds of challenges I've just been talking about, where the innovation, where the new efforts are being made, the new attempts to find solutions, it's in the community.